For most of human history, value could not remain still. It moved with people, animals, and seasonal opportunity. Wealth was carried, exchanged, remembered, and renegotiated continuously. It existed through proximity and repetition rather than permanent storage. Such systems functioned within small groups, where memory and obligation could be maintained through direct relationships. But as populations grew and settlements became permanent, these conditions no longer held. Value needed to persist beyond individual presence. It needed to survive absence, delay, and scale. Before coins, before banks, belief ruled the world. The emergence of early urban societies required a form of wealth that could remain in place. That requirement was met not by metal or coinage, but by grain. Before agriculture, subsistence economies relied on immediacy. Food was consumed quickly or moved with the group. Livestock offered a partial solution, but animals required constant care, could wander or die, and differed significantly in size, health, and productivity. They were difficult to divide and harder to standardize. Trust itself functioned as a form of value, but only within limited social ranges. Beyond those limits, memory failed and disputes multiplied. Obligations weakened once they exceeded the span of personal familiarity. Wealth remained social rather than material. This began to change with the domestication of cereal crops. In regions such as Mesopotamia, predictable seasonal flooding deposited fertile silt along river valleys. These conditions favored the cultivation of grain, particularly barley, which tolerated variable soils and salinity better than other early crops. Grain agriculture introduced permanence. Fields replaced foraging zones. Harvest cycles replaced daily acquisition. Surplus could be produced deliberately rather than incidentally. Most importantly, surplus could be stored. Once harvested and dried, barley could be preserved for extended periods. It did not need to move. It did not require negotiation. It did not depend on memory or reputation. Grain remained where it was placed. This immobility allowed surplus to be centralized. Storage facilities associated with temples and administrative compounds became repositories of accumulated labor and future subsistence. Control over storage became control over distribution. A stock of barley represented past work, future survival, and authority over time. Food could be released or withheld. Rations could be delayed. Access to sustenance could be conditioned. This marked the emergence of institutional power grounded in storage. Grain also introduced a property no earlier form of value could sustain: repeatable measurement. Animals vary, promises vary, but grain can be divided into equivalent quantities. Volume can be assessed visually. Quantity can be verified mechanically. This made grain legible to centralized administration in a way earlier forms of wealth had not been. Standardization required physical instruments. Archaeological excavations from the Uruk period reveal thousands of bevel-rimmed bowls. These vessels dominate certain layers of the archaeological record. They were produced rapidly, pressed into molds, fired quickly, and discarded after use. This was not household pottery, it was industrial output. Each bowl held a fixed volume of grain. These bowls functioned as ration containers. Compensation was not negotiated individually. It was allocated according to predefined measures. If the bowl was filled to the rim, the obligation was met. If it was not, it was not. The container made the allocation visible. No written explanation was required. The measure itself communicated compliance, but the bowl alone was not sufficient. To ensure exactness, administrators employed leveling tools, simple straight sticks drawn across the rim of the vessel. Excess grain was removed. Nothing could mound above the edge. Nothing could remain by accident or favor. The surface of the ration was flattened deliberately. This act mattered. It demonstrates that precision was enforced not only in total volume, but at the margin. Even a small surplus was treated as a breach of standard. The measure was not approximate, it was exact. By standardizing both the container and its final surface, authorities eliminated discretion at the point of distribution. Grain payment also required the development of broader measurement systems. If compensation was made in barley, equivalence became a practical problem. How full was full? How consistent was fair? This pressure produced standardized weights, reference measures, and leveling practices shared across administrative sites. Authority did not merely control the grain, it controlled the definition of the unit. Disputes no longer relied on memory or testimony. They were resolved through tools. Measurement replaced negotiation. Verification replaced reputation. Grain also introduced time into accounting. Livestock can be exchanged on any day. Grain is harvested once per year. Lending grain in one season and receiving it back after harvest required accounting for delay. A unit of barley at planting time was not equivalent to a unit of barley after a growing season. This temporal difference produced the earliest forms of interest, not as moral judgment, but as arithmetic. Time acquired measurable weight. Calendars became accounting instruments. Seasons became financial boundaries. But storing grain introduced a new constraint. Unlike metal, grain is biological. It absorbs moisture. It decays. It attracts insects and rodents. In centralized storage, loss was inevitable. Administrators had to account for shrinkage. A deposit made in spring would not return intact in winter. This required systematic accounting for loss and degradation. Stored value had to be adjusted over time. Grain could also be compromised deliberately. Inferior grasses, chaff, or debris could be mixed into tribute to meet required quantities. This forced the development of inspection and quality control. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities shows sieving areas and separation tools. Grain was sorted by wind and mesh. Purity mattered, quality mattered. Records did not only track quantity, they tracked grade. Consistent inferiority affected standing within the system. Reliability became legible. This represents an early form of differentiated obligation based on past performance. Alongside bowls and storage facilities, another object reveals how trust itself was managed. Before writing became widespread, administrators used small clay tokens to represent quantities of goods. To prevent tampering, these tokens were sealed inside hollow clay spheres known as bullae. The exterior of the bulla was marked with impressions corresponding to the contents inside. Trust was no longer carried socially, it was enclosed physically. To alter the record, the clay had to be broken. Verification required destruction. Integrity was enforced through material containment rather than belief. These bullae demonstrate that obligation itself had become an object. Value was no longer remembered. It was sealed. Later, impressions on the surface replaced the tokens inside. The container became the record. This transition marks the direct predecessor of writing. The clearest evidence for this system is not found in narrative texts or later tradition. It appears in refuse layers and administrative remains. At Uruk, widely regarded as the earliest true city, the late 4th millennium BCE reveals an unprecedented level of material standardization. The bevel-rimmed bowl appears in overwhelming numbers. Its ubiquity indicates routine use at scale. Such standardization would not be necessary in a kin-based economy. Alongside these vessels, early clay tablets record grain distributions. These proto-cuneiform documents are administrative lists. They are not myths, laws, or epics. They record attendance and allocation. One recurring sign depicts a human head oriented toward a small bowl. In early writing, this sign denotes both consumption and ration. Eating and compensation were treated as the same act. Each entry corresponds to a measured allotment. When the caloric content of these rations is compared to physiological needs, a pattern emerges. The allocation was sufficient to sustain adult labor, but insufficient to accumulate surplus. This was not market exchange. It was maintenance. The grain standard did not simply store value. It regulated bodies. Survival became conditional on participation within an administrative system. Dependence was stabilized. Land was transformed as well. Irrigated fields replaced flexible territories. Property boundaries replaced remembered use. Control over soil became control over subsistence. Value no longer moved with people. People moved toward stored value. The grain standard made cities possible. It also made dependency permanent. Only later would metal detach value from biological decay and seasonal constraint. Only later would coinage free value from storage loss and harvest cycles. But the core logic was already established. Value had become measurable, repeatable, and centrally controlled. And it was allocated by volume. In the next episode, we will examine how honey became one of the earliest portable stores of value in human history. Unlike grain, sweetness could travel, resist decay, and detach value from land and storage.